Welcome everyone. We're going to talk today about optimizing the AscentialTest project. And so I think this will be a good presentation for folks who are brand new and folks who have used the product for a while. Also, part of this presentation, I'm going to be doing something new, and I'll talk about that as I go through the overview. I'll start about talking about project organization. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about naming conventions. We'll talk about how to manage snapshots. I'm going to talk about attributes, both in the test plan and in the test project management feature. Talk a little bit about organizing our test data. And then I think a really important topic about determining the optimum scope of a test. And this is something that we get asked about a lot. So I'm going to go into that a little bit more deeply. And then a couple of new things. I decided that it would be a good idea to share recent tips from tech support. We get calls, and sometimes the same call really from different folks, the same topic. And so we started collecting those, and I'm going to go over the ones that I thought would be kind of applicable to a lot of us. So we're going to talk about, I think there are 4 that I'm going to talk about there. And then I'm also going to demonstrate some new features. We have a new release that is about 3/4 of the way, and some of the features are ready to demonstrate. And some were suggested by some of you. So I'll be going over those as well. Let's start by talking about project organization. I want to talk about use of files. Let me just organize my other screen so that I can see my notes. Pardon me a moment. There we go. One thing that maybe not everybody knows is that when we ship AscentialTest, we ship one app objects file, we ship one test file, one step file. And that's really just to get you started. But I say that's really kind of artificial, because a real project would benefit from having multiple files. And so if you look at my Project Explorer for this sample project, you'll notice that I've got multiple files for app objects, multiple files for steps, multiple files for tests, and I've also organized them. The organization of files in AscentialTest is maybe not so obvious. I think everyone knows how to do that with steps and tests. I'll go over that anyway, but it's not so obvious, I think, with files. And the reason is to do that, you actually have to right click. First of all, you have to actually create these folders. You have to assign them to a group in order to get them in folders. And that's a little bit different than the way that we handle everything else. And the reason is because everything else, like a step, it's something that you actually open right here in AscentialTest, and you can put in a group, right? That's kind of obvious in the user interface. Or if it isn't, you might be curious and play with it, and then you'll find out what it does. But not so with files. So with files, really you have to know that you can assign them to a group. And once you do that, once you assign the first file to a group, it creates the group, just like we create the groups for steps and tests and so forth. But you see that it does help with the organization of the different components that make up the project library. So you've got your steps, your tests, and everything else in little folders like that. Okay, so really 2 points here. Organize your files by assigning them to groups, and then by all means, create multiple app objects, steps, and tests. Why might you do that? Well, if you've got more than one person on your team and you're using version control, you'll have less contention for a file if you divide up these components across multiple files. Just want to go over groups in case folks don't know where all the groups are. I showed you how to do a group for a file by assigning a group. With tests and steps, we have our group field right here. And before you assign any groups at all, there's nothing in this dropdown. You have to actually type into it. But then once you start to populate it, you will see that groups are there, and instead of typing, you can just select them from the dropdown. That's true of tests. That's true of steps and tests. It's also true of data tables. I think sometimes people miss this one because it's sitting up here. Same thing with plans, sitting right here. So it's a good, I think, practice to take advantage of those groups. Again, because it makes your project just that much cleaner and more organized. Now, when you put things in groups, you don't lose the fact that you can still look for them alphabetically, because sometimes we know what we're looking for and we want to find it alphabetically. So using groups doesn't mean that you can't search for things alphabetically. You can always search for things alphabetically by file or by group. I tend to keep the group view as my default, but that's up to you. Now, the same is true as snapshot management as well. And I think this is actually almost more important. And the reason is because if we don't organize our snapshots, if you're like me, you'll end up taking another one because you can't find the one that you're looking for. And when we do that, we end up with kind of a messy project. And so it's pretty important, I think, that you don't have anything in unassigned. I left something in there on purpose just so that I can show you to assign it, how to assign it. But if you look here in your app object view, you'll notice that almost all, except for the one that I left for an example, my snapshots are organized in these groups. And these groups come from this field called primary app object. Now, when you define a new object through drag and drop, AscentialTest assigns the primary app object for you automatically. I think most of you probably know that if you went and right-clicked and did a rename, it would also rename the primary app object. It's a relatively new feature. But sometimes you take another snapshot of a page that you've already got a snapshot for, but there's a good reason for it. Maybe you want to have, a snapshot in a different context. And so to take something that's unassigned and assign it is really just a matter of coming up here, finding the app object that you want to assign it to, and then you see the unassigned category goes away and that snapshot ends up here with the other one that you had previously taken. Now, of course, you also have the comment field here. And so if you do have snapshots that are in different contexts, I don't think I have any in this particular project, you can always add a comment. Just want to show you what that looks like. So if I do add a comment and then I look, I'll see the comment right here. So that helps me when I'm looking at these little tiny thumbnails and I really can't tell what's different between them. I can look for the comment and that will tell me. So those are good practices in terms of organizing your project, using the file names, using the groups for files, steps, tests, plans, data tables, and even functions as well. So if you are looking at your Actions Explorer, you'll notice that I used groups for all my functions as well. So if we look at a function, we'll see the functions have that same group. And of course, the description as well, so that when I hover over something, I see the description. I want to talk a little bit about naming conventions. And we get asked about this a lot too. And my response is always the same. Go with the flow and adopt Xenix's naming conventions. And what that means is that we uppercase all the significant letters and we limit the use of underscores. So only when you maybe feel like you absolutely need to because you've got two capital letters or something sitting next to each other. But otherwise, we use that, camelback notation. And you see that when we drag and drop in AscentialTest. So if you adopt the same convention, then you'll find that you're not doing a whole lot of renaming. And that would apply to app objects, steps, tests, parameters, the names of plans, suites, test sets. There's a slight difference with plans, suites, and test sets because here you can use spaces, right? Whereas you can't add a space in the name of an app object or a step or a test or a parameter. And you know that because if you tried to do that, the field where you're naming the entity will turn red. Not so with plans, suites, and test sets because those are file names. And of course, file names can have spaces. But I still encourage you to use the capitalization of the significant words. Data tables, types. So there's a lot of different entities that need to be named. We also like to keep our names short, but not cryptic. Not so cryptic that if you look at it, you have no idea what it means. So you kind of have to find the sweet spot there. Something that's descriptive enough, but not so long that it takes up a lot of room when you're using it. Because then if you have very long names, then you're going to find yourself using the scroll bars more. Personally, I tend to favor names of what the user sees on the screen rather than internal program names, because I think it makes the automation just a whole lot easier to read and to maintain, especially when you've got, multiple folks participating in an AscentialTest project. So I talked a little bit about this already. I kind of jumped ahead with snapshot management using that primary app object. Again, because you won't be as likely to take a new snapshot if you can easily locate the one that you've already got. I tend to also remove, you can see this project's pretty trim. I remove app objects that are duplicates. So if I did take a duplicate, I usually get rid of it. I just don't like a lot of snapshots cluttering up my project. Sometimes we get asked a question, if we have a lot of snapshots, is that going to slow down the execution time? And no, absolutely not, because the snapshots are not part of the test that gets compiled and run. So the number of snapshots that you have will have no bearing on the execution time of your tests. I also encourage the use of series. I like snapshot series myself, mostly just because of the way that a snapshot series keeps your desktop nice and clean. You don't have a lot of tabs, and I think it's easy to get from snapshot to snapshot because you can see them in the order of your test. So I use snapshots myself in my tests. I do like them. Now I want to talk about some test management features. We're going to talk about project attributes. I think folks are familiar with them more in plans, and suites and tests, and maybe not so much in tests. I misspoke there. I meant plans, suites, and test sets. Maybe not so much in tests. So I want to talk about that now. So let's talk about this plan right here first. You can see that in this particular plan, I have used 3 attributes. I've got my test type attribute where I can label my tests positive or negative. And if you don't know, by the way, these are all user defined. So I created test type, priority, and test level. You can create as many attributes as you want, and you can make them any type that you want as well. The way that you turn them on and off so that they display in the plan is just click on these little icons down below if you want to turn them off. They're toggles. There's another way to do it as well. You could go up to plan columns and you can check them and uncheck them. So that's another way to turn them on and off. I tend to just do it here because it's right in front of me. And of course, the way that the attributes are used is in conjunction with a query. So if I go up to my Mark menu and I select Mark by Query, I can create a new query or I can use an existing one because they're all saved here. And so if I want to just mark my positive tests, I've got a query that says where the test type equals positive. I click OK. And what's going on here? Why is it not? Why is it not? Oh, it's telling me I don't have a valid scope here. That's interesting. Let's see what's going on. Of course, some of you are watching and saying, Brian, come on, wake up. Yeah, look at that. Test type is not a valid scope. So let's see if we can edit this query and get it to work. So the test type is positive. There we go. I must have changed the type. And so it locates my tests based on the results of my query. And then of course, if I click on this button here, it would run only those tests. So attributes are useful. You have very large test plans, you have large suites, you have large test sets, they're always available. Now you set them in the plan, but then in the suite, although you can't set them, they are still available to you. And you can display them as well. So you can display them, across the, they have to be set though, however, and in this particular case, they're probably not set. But you can certainly, here we go, they're set in this particular plan. So just like I had displayed them in my plan, I can display them in my suite. I can't change the values here. They're set in the plan, but they can be used using the query in either the suite or in the test set. So the same idea in the test set. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I think most of you are familiar with attributes inside of the test plan, but maybe not so much inside of the test. So let's talk about that. So I've got an empty test here, and I'll put that test plan into insert mode. If I come over here to my Project Explorer and I come to tests, I can say query tests. And what query tests will do for me is it'll find all the tests that match a query. So I set up a query ahead of time here. And of course, I can edit it using the same queried by example that you use when you're creating your attribute queries. But if I execute that, you'll notice that it finds all the tests that match the query. So if I'm creating a test plan for a particular module and I have used the module name, and I'll show you where that is in a minute, for all of my tests, then it does make it easy to then take my tests and just drag them and drop them over to the plan. So I don't have to go looking for them here. I can execute a query, find them, drag them, and drop them. Now, the way that's set, and it's funny, I sometimes forget about it myself. We're all, I think, trained to look at the parameters tab because we use it so much. But there's also this attributes tab that's sitting right next to it. And these attributes are the very same attributes that you have in your test plans. They're all created by going here to project attributes and creating attributes that can be used in plans, suites, test sets, or in tests like I've done here. So that might be new to you, even if you've used the product for a while. Now, since we're here, this isn't exactly the same feature, but it's related. So I do want to just remind you all that when you have a test, you're creating a test, and you want to find your steps, there is a similar feature in Find Steps. So if I come over here to Steps, and I right click and I say Find Steps, it's not a query. Just to remind you, with tests, it was a query. So we say Query Tests, and we set up an attribute query. We have a slightly different system in Steps. We might implement that in Steps at some point as well. But right now, the way Find Steps works is I can come here and using wildcards, I can say something like that. Maybe order is my module, and it will find all the steps that match my query. And then just like with what we just looked at, I can select multiples, drag and drop, and they should. You can drag them and drop them, and you can usually select multiples. Let's see if I can get that to work for you. It's going to be stubborn. Well, we'll do them one at a time for now. So you can drag them and drop them right out of Find Steps. Again, it's easier than having to come over here and look through my Project Explorer. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about test data. Let's go over to our data tables. Test data can be reused, just like steps can be reused or tests can be reused. What I'm showing you here is, here's a table where I've got information about a particular, let's say, customer. And this particular customer, has a last name, first name, and so forth. And they also have a credit card. Now, rather than putting all the credit card data right here, and having credit card number, expiration date, and so forth, I have a separate table that has that. And so here I have the key field, Visa, MasterCard, Discover, and then the information about that particular card. And the reason why I'm doing that is I'm referring to the key field here, but I've got the data for it here. And of course, the reason I'm doing that is because you know how you have test credit cards in a test environment and they expire and so forth. And rather than have to revisit, potentially hundreds of records here, if I just use a key field and then I have another table that has my cards in it, I can just change it in one place. So that's a whole lot easier. And I have an example here that shows how that works. So let me find it for you. Let's see if I can find it here. So example of using. So just to remind you, I've got my two tables, got my key field here that references this second table. And if I come here to my step and I run it, I can pick anyone really. And we'll see that right here, I printed the credit card from the first table. So we see print customer data .credit card, and that came from the customer data table. That's this one here. And then the second one, the number itself, came from the test cards data, because I used the credit card from the first table to look up the data for the particular credit card in the second table. And that's where we get this here. Now let's talk a little bit about the scope of tests. I think this is something that new users have a lot of questions about. Where does one step start and end? There are some common steps that I think we should all be using. For example, there should be a step that opens up a window. That should be separate from the step that actually completes, for example, a form or fills out the window. So there's an open step. Save can either be a separate step or it could be optional to the step that actually completes the page or form. I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute. Close can be completely generic. In most applications, you can just have one close method. I'm going to show you mine in just a moment. Now, the rough rule of thumb is that you'd have a step for every page. I sometimes break that rule myself when I know that maybe the actions across 2 pages makes up some unit of work that I'm never going to divide. The key to deciding where a step starts and ends has to do with reusability. The goal is to be able to reuse your steps as much as possible, right? Because that not only means less work to do to create the steps, but even more importantly, it means less to maintain when the target application changes. So we want to work hard to make sure that our steps are as reusable as possible. And the key to that is when you create a step, think about how it might be used in different tests. And if adding some actions to that step would make it no longer as reusable, then take those actions and put them in a separate step instead. I'm going to show you in a minute that you can kind of have your cake and eat it too, if you will, because you can have steps call other steps. So if you're thinking, you know, I don't want to have very granular steps because then I have to drag so many of them in, that's not true, because you can have steps that are bigger blocks that call other steps. And I'll show you a couple of examples. First thing I want to do, though, is I want to show you that close that I was talking about. So just clean up my project here so that it's easier to see. So you'll notice that, you know, in my groups, I have something called comment because that's maybe going to be used across my whole project. But here's my close. Basically, all it does is it takes in a string that represents the window that I want to close, and by putting the reference operator in front of it and calling the built-in close method, it will close most windows. Of course, there are exceptions, but in most cases, this will suffice. So you don't have to have 100 close methods or steps for all the different windows in your application. You can just have one in most cases, or very few. Now I want to show you an example of what I think is a pretty good example of scope. So let's look at an example. Bear with me a moment. I'm going to find my example. And verify an employee. Let's see. There we go. So here's a test that calls a number of tests. This is kind of a typical test, I would say. You can see I've got a step that just opens up the screen. So that's all it does. Just opens up the screen. Then another one that's going to add or edit the employee. So notice add or edit. I can use this to add a new employee, but because of the way that I designed it, I can use it for edit as well. I don't have to have a separate step for add and edit. And I'll show you something that I tend to do. If I have the potential for saving, I usually use a Boolean to determine whether or not I do want to save in this particular use of the step. And the reason why is that, let's say that I had a tabbed MDI child or a tabbed dialogue where I might have to fill out multiple pages in order to complete a record that I want to submit. Well, if I hard code always save, that would mean that I don't then have the ability to combine this step with another step that might go to the next tab and put more information in, the next tab, put more information in. So the way I would do that is that each one, I'd have a separate step for each tab, and every single step would end with this same if be save, click on save, because that means that I'm not dictating that for this particular tab, I'm always going to click save. I can let the data tell AscentialTest whether in this particular call to this step, we're going to click the save button. So just by doing that, I'm making this step more reusable. It can now be used with other steps in a multiple tabbed situation, and any one of them could be used to click the save. I might be just going in to one of the tabs and editing it, and then clicking save. Now, that reminds me of something else that I think perhaps a lot of us don't know. When you use either set or verify in AscentialTest, and you pass it a null value, AscentialTest is going to skip it. And that's actually pretty important and pretty interesting, because that means that when I'm creating a data-driven step, I can include an action to set every single field on my form, whether or not a particular call to that step is going to actually pass data, that's actually what's going to determine whether or not anything happens in this set. So it means that if I wanted to use this step to edit an employee and maybe change only their address, I can call this same step that was used to add the employee in the first place, but provide it with only the data that I want to change. And so when it comes into this step, it's going to skip all the ones that I'm passing a null to. And that can be in any of my data tables. I can have a null value in any of these fields. And I might as well just remind you all that a no value looks like this. If you've gone into that field and you've done that, that's no longer a null value. To put the null value back in there, it's Alt-N. And then you'll see that there's a null value sitting there. But if this step is run and any of these values are null, that would be with set or with verify, it's going to be skipped. So you're basically instructing AscentialTest on how to run your step based on the data that you provide to the step. So it makes it really easy to make data-driven steps and tests. Now I want to show you an example of those larger blocks that I was talking about. So I've got verify new purchase order. Let's see if I've got that here. Don't have it in this particular test, but let me find it. I'll alphabetize them. It's called verify new purchase order. Let's see. Why am I not seeing it? Let me try to find it this way. Thought it was that one. Let's see. No. Where did it go? Excuse me. Yes, verify new purchase order. I must not have noted it exactly right. All right, I apologize for that. I thought I had it. I thought I had recorded the name correctly, but evidently I did not. But let me go ahead and demonstrate one for you instead. So what I can do is I can create a new step. So I can create a step, and I'm just randomly going to drag in a couple of steps where my step can call other steps. So then when I include this particular step in a test, any of the parameters that are in these steps is going to bubble up, so that when I drag it over, I'm only dragging one step over to the test, but in turn, it's calling perhaps 1, 2, 3 other steps. So it allows you to have bigger blocks that you can reuse. And the hope is that that will encourage you to be more granular, so that you won't, put more into a step than you really should, just so that you have less steps to drag and drop. And of course, you could always create a group for these as well. You can create a group called, combination steps or something like that, or multi-steps, so that they're all grouped together. Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about how data could be used in a couple of different ways. Most of us, I think, are familiar with using data tables. And that's because when we do our POCs, that's usually the way that we teach you how to do your POC, how we teach you how to do your data. But there are different ways of using data that in some cases might be more efficient. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Let me get you an example for that as well. If we look at purchase orders, I've actually got the same test here, but I've got it done two different ways. So this is going to point to the same test. It's verify new purchase order, but in one case, the data is in a data table, and in the other case, it's directly in the plan. So here is sort of the more typical way of constructing a test. So I've got my purchase order, I've got my positive tests, and again, it says with the data in the data table. So I've got three instances of this test. First one uses TCO1. The second one, uses TCO2 and TCO3. So that's kind of typical. But there's another way to do it that if someone didn't tell you, you might not know. In AscentialTest, instead of binding to a data table, and I'll show you what it looks like when you bind to a data table, you see something like this, where this particular test is getting its data out of this table. And you can navigate to that table and see the data. That's the table we just looked at. But this test is a little different. You'll notice there is no data table here. We're not binding to a data table. Instead, I parameterized my test in the exact same way that you parameterize your step using add parameters. And so it created parameters in much the same way that it creates parameters for steps. But look where the data is. The data is here in the plan instead. Not like this. Here we've just got the TCO1, TCO2. Here, what you can do is you can put I call it like my default data. I can put it here at the parent node. And then you can override it at the subsequent nodes, but you don't have to. So what that means is that if you want to inherit, and you'll notice that in blue, that means I didn't key the data. The data was put here. So when the data displays in black, it means it was input at that level. So at the top level, the parent level, I put in the sales rep and the cust ID. In these other tests, these instances of the test, I'm inheriting, in this case, the sales rep, but I overrode the cust ID, and here's my item list. So you can see that in some ways, this could be more efficient, because if later I want to change the sales rep, because maybe the database has changed, I can just go to this one place and change it, and everywhere where it was inherited, because maybe I don't really care about it, it'll automatically get updated for me. So that's a different data strategy that you might not be as familiar with. Okay, now in our remaining time, I want to talk about a few things. I want to talk about some recent calls that we've gotten, and I've already talked about one of them, but I'll review it. But here's one that's come up a couple of times just in the last few weeks. And it has to do with selectors. So a lot of times when we create our selectors, we use the keyword like, instead of equal, because we want to be able to use wildcards in our selector values. Normally when we do that, let me get one for you. So I'm going to go to my App Objects panel here. And let's come here. This is a convenient one. And let's go here, purchase orders. Okay, so I'm in my select order. And I've got my select by customer name here. And here's the selector that, most of us, I think, typically use, where we're using like, and then we've got our parameter value. But when we come in here, we can say things like this. We can say McCarthy, and that's going to match. I could do this. That found 6 matches, but it did match. But in order to use the wildcard, I have to put the wildcard in. That's not such a big deal here when we're testing, but in our tests, well, we might not remember. We might not feel like we have to put wildcards in everywhere. So what we can do instead, I'm going to comment this one out and uncomment this one. Notice now that MCCA matches anyway, even though I didn't put the wildcard there. And the reason why is because I built the wildcard into the selector itself. So you can see that after the word like, I've got a wildcard, and then inside the curlies, I've got the parameter name and then the wildcard. So it means that I'm going to find matches as if there was a wildcard in the beginning and the end of my selectors. So it makes the selectors a little bit easier to use when you're using wildcards. Now, here's one that I have to admit to you, I had forgotten about, or I'm sure I knew at one time, but I had forgotten about it. And relearned it fairly recently. And what this has to do with is it has to do with selecting from a pop-up table or other kind of selector where there's more than one selection with the same string maybe, or a partial string. So let's just say, for example, that you had a drop-down and it had 2 S103, 4, 5, 6. To me, it seems a little strange, but I actually saw an application just recently where we had something just like this. What I had forgotten is that you can use a selector, a built-in selector on a drop-down. You'll notice that here I'm saying new employee.manager ID. This is the drop-down. I'm not then saying select. I'm saying .item, and I'm using a selector on the item because the selector does allow me to include indexes. So this allows me to find the second occurrence of this particular manager ID. And then of course I could say first, last, so on and so forth. This works with wildcards as well, and I'm going to try to demonstrate that for you in just a second. So you can also use wildcards, and you can use the indexes with them. So let me find something else here. So I'm going to go to new employee, and I'm going to use this field right here. And let me find my step. Hopefully I'm going to have better luck finding things this time. Otherwise, I'll just build it again from scratch. So let's see. So select by customer. See if I can put my hands on that. Let's select by customer name. See if I can find that. So if we come over to our app objects, whoops. Employee maintenance. Select by customer name. Whoops. Let's select order. Need employee maintenance. It's being edited. Okay, hang on. There we go. Here's my manager ID field. So my manager ID field doesn't have a ton of values, but I've got some values that begin with the letter S. And so if I come back here, if I want to say something like new employee manager ID item select, let's just copy that. Let's see. I'm going to try to select from that field. Create that for you. Let's make this a little larger so we can see. And so I've got I'll set up my event. I'm going to go ahead and append it. Now remember, if I try to use the selector, it's the value itself, I'm not going to be able to do what I need to do. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to use item, open up a square bracket like that. And then inside the square brackets, I can use a selector like S star. See if that matches what I've got here. So I'm saying new employee manager ID dot item. And then I'm going to say I want the second one. So if I run that, you notice what happened was it selected the second item that began with the letter S. So that makes the selectors even more powerful to be able to combine wildcards with indexes by using the built-in selector. Again, a feature that I had forgotten and had to relearn recently. Finally, just reminding you that set, which internally is set value, and verify, which is internally verify value, will skip if the data that is passed to it is null. Again, this came up recently, and I just covered that a few minutes ago. So important features again, to make your steps and your tests more reusable. Now, I want to talk about a couple of new features that are coming. And this first one was suggested by a customer. I can't remember who, but you probably know if you're watching. Let me show you. Make this a little bit larger. I'm going to go to results, and I'm going to look at the results, or two from yesterday. I'm going to give you a second to look at that and see if it jumps out at anybody. What's changed about the results? I'll kind of scroll through the top and the bottom. That's kind of giving you a hint of what we've changed. So in the current release of AscentialTest, we were not highlighting the fact that these actions came from onStart and that these actions at the end were coming from onFinish. I think it was particularly tricky at the very end of the test because you couldn't tell where the last step stopped and where the onStart began, onFinish began. So in the next release of AscentialTest, you'll see that the onStart and the onFinish are noted just like all the steps, and you can collapse them and expand them. So I think that's a nice new feature. It makes the output a whole lot easier to interpret. I'm not going to demonstrate this next one for you, but I want to tell you about it. There was a bug that someone reported where when you ran your tests from command line and you increased the build number, it was showing up on your reports, but it wasn't updating the build number in the test set like it would if you had run from AscentialTest. So that issue has been resolved. And so now, whether you run from your AscentialTest or you run it from the command line and you include the new build number, then that build number will now be reflected in AscentialTest. So that later on, if you go to AscentialTest and generate reports, it will pick up the new build number. I think that's what's most important. Now, this next one I'm really excited about. In the past, we did not support multiple selection in the Project Explorer or in the Elements panel. So I want to show you what we've done. And I think there's probably a lot of you that are going to be pretty happy about this. So let's just go over here. I'll just create a new test. So if I'm in a test and I want to drag over multiple steps, I could now select the multiple steps and drag them over and drop them. There's some really weird hesitation on my machine while I am demoing today. I don't know if it has to do with, that wasn't nice. Let's bring that back up again. I am on a development build. We'll try that again. Here we go. I've got an existing test here. So again, I can come into my steps, hold down the control key, drag and drop, and I can get multiple. And it can be across your group boundaries as well. So it doesn't matter where they are. You can highlight them. You can either do multiple selection with the control key, like I showed you, or you can also use the shift key. So you can highlight multiple, either with shift or with control. So that's one place. Another place is here in the plan. So let's just say that you've got a new plan, and let's go to a plan, put it in insert mode. And I can take my tests, and again, I can now highlight multiples, and I can drag them and drop them. So it's a whole lot easier to do drag and drop now from the Project Explorer. So you can multiple select steps, you can multiple select tests. The other thing that you can do is that just drag over main window. You've always been able to multiple select from a snapshot, right? You could always do this and drag over. So if I come over here, drag this, you could always mouse down on the OK and drag and drop, and you get them both. But you weren't able to do that inside of the Elements panel. So now you can select multiples in the Elements panel and drag them and drop them. And that can be really important because, you know, sometimes if you've got a very, you've got a user interface where things are very tight, very close together inside of the snapshot, it can be hard sometimes using your mouse in order to find the different components that you want to define. So I find myself in those situations coming over to the Elements panel and just selecting. And it's always bothered me that you can only do them one at a time. So now you can use the Control key or you can use the Shift key to select multiples, and you can drag and drop. So those are new features that are coming down. Another thing that we've done, and this was a suggestion from someone, is that you'll find that all of the dialog boxes now, when you bring up a dialog box, the cursor will always be in the first field on the dialog box so that you don't have to take your mouse and click. You can just start typing. Likewise, there's always a default push button. So if you brought up a dialog box and you just want to click OK, you can just hit the Enter key and the dialog box will, will dismiss. So just improvements to the user interface. And thanks to whoever recommended that. I think it was a good addition. So in summary, we talked about project organization. We talked about naming conventions, managing our snapshots, using our primary app object, pretty important. Using attributes not only in plans and suites and test sets, but also in our tests in order to locate our tests. Organizing our test data. Maybe you've learned some new way of organizing your data, whether that be using key fields to point to another table or to use the plan to organize your data as opposed to a data table. And we talked about determining the optimum scope of a test. Covered some recent tips from tech support and then a demonstration of new features.